Transferable skills.
From Cackle Media, this is Transferable Skills. I'm Noah Mishkin. Today's guest is Lucy Todd, who shares her skills journey from startup leadership into career discovery coaching. There's one more note to the audience here. You'll notice a little bit of disturbance in the force. My microphone had some sort of software bug, and it wasn't noticed until after this fantastic interview had concluded. So apologies. You can probably get the gist of what I'm saying, but you'll hear some clipping going on. I hope you enjoy. Lucy, it's great to have you here on the show today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Take us back to the beginning of your career.
As soon as I graduated college, I actually landed an internship at a tech startup. So I was very lucky there, like literally in the summer, got that. And within a couple of weeks, it turned into a job offer. And that turned into a leadership role and just onward and onward from there. So literally as this fresh college graduate, I was like, this is it. This is the dream. I made it.
And that's how easy it is to get a job. Just
For everybody.
You get an internship, it turns into the next 20 years, bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah, absolutely. I recognized how lucky I was to have landed something like that.
Did you know that there was a chance it would turn into a full-time position afterwards, or was that sort of a surprise based on how you were doing?
No, yeah, it was a surprise. It was the person who was my supervisor at the time ended up putting in his notice a couple of weeks into my tenure there, and I ended up taking over his role. So I was hired to just write articles about tech and e-commerce. And as it evolved, another part of the business ended up taking over. The founders had started designing infographics for people and speaking out about the power of visual communication. And this was back in 2011, and when infographics were just taking off. And that ended up being the side of the business that took off. So while I was hired to write blogs about e-commerce, I eventually became the head of content and project management for a visual communication design agency without having to leave. So I had a nonlinear college education. Right out of high school, I went to art school as my first college trip. And after a year, I realized that was not for me, dropped out, took a break, went to figure some stuff out. So it was then that I landed my first kind of corporate role. It was a summer temp job, and it was, filing and phone calls and paperwork and things like that.
All the exciting stuff.
Yeah, I had a weird out-of-body moment, even in just those few months of full-time work, where one day I was like washing dishes after work, and I was holding a plate, and I was like, what file does this plate go in? And then I freaked out because that is a weird thought to have. And I was like, this can't be it. Like, if I am this messed up mentally after a few months, and one of my coworkers there had just celebrated 35 years with the company, I was like, no, get me out of here.
Yeah, that ain't going to be me.
So that prompted me to go back to school that very fall. And I went back and got my bachelor's in creative writing, which, as many would say, oh, English degree, what are you going to do with that? But my internship that I then landed right after that was based on writing. And that, again, carried me into the next 10 years of my career.
What would you say to those people who ask that question?
Yeah, I think for me, it was an early sign that following your interests, things that you actually enjoy doing, is key to enjoyment throughout your life.
You already credited your English degree in getting that first job.
Yes. It went on to really help with the development of my project management skills, my leadership skills, communication, and just on and on. And so I think it's very easy from the outside to look at it and say, oh, great, you can write a sentence. Like, good for you. We all have to do that.
After your internship, what was that role?
Yeah, so the company was about 5 people when I joined. And obviously, as the infographics side of things was beginning to take shape. So I became the head of the content team and was tasked with building a team of writers, as well as, since it was a startup, being an individual contributor myself. So sort of balancing that leadership, management, and writing and client management role. And then as our executive team took shape, which was about 4 years later, we became officially execs, an executive team insofar as titles go. And so once the current head of project management left, I then became the sort of co-head of both the content and project management teams, and then became in charge of managing and hiring those teams as well.
Who taught you how to be a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a fast-paced startup, we did not have the privilege of some of the on-site leadership and training that probably a more corporate setting may have provided. So it was definitely a lead by example, learn from the founders and owners type situation. That said, I had also been the head of literary journals at my community college and also my four-year college. So I got a little taste of leadership there, where I was managing the team of editors and reviewers and everybody there. So I wasn't going in completely unfamiliar with leadership, but there definitely was a lot of learn on the job, learn by doing.
Were there mistakes that you can remember today that you learned a lot from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do just remember often feeling like a deer in headlights, where I needed to have difficult conversations with people over client issues or performance issues, and learning for the first time how to have disciplinary conversations. And the more of those opportunities that I had, the more I realized how uncomfortable I was with that situation. Definitely to a significant degree, I'm sure that had to do with training. I'm sure that I could have felt better equipped with a little more leadership training, but there was also a significant personality and talent and interest component to that, where the more and more that I was in situations where I needed to communicate business decisions that had already been made or pursue disciplinary conversations, the more I began to realize that the management of people was just not in my blood. I was not enjoying the experience of telling people how it is and how it had to be. Now, this is not to say that the company was, toxic or anything like that. We were all learning as we were going.
Sometimes you have to have uncomfortable conversations with people. Like, how do you actually effectively communicate something, especially when there are legal implications involved? How do you do it with grace too? The opportunity for the person to have dignity.
Absolutely. The difference between the types of conversations where my team was coming to me looking for insight, looking for support and advice, I always left those meetings feeling uplifted and excited that I was able to support them. And it was just such a stark contrast from the times when I needed to go in and just say what needed to be said, or what I was being encouraged to say, by leadership.
Yeah.
And I will say that happened more and more as our company grew and was then acquired. And that was a significant jump, where I moved from mostly being able to make decisions on my own with the support of our small executive team to then being like a low middle manager in a giant pond of 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at the rude awakening, your whole environment changes and protocol changes and style, methodology, and practice change. And when you go from a small team into how your skills needed to be a leader in a larger team in a much bigger company changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when the company was much smaller and just a startup, it was definitely more about leaning on my instincts and the advice of my peers. So I did lean a lot more on my empathy, on my ability to problem solve and rationalize and see all sides of a situation. As the company grew and got acquired, and again, I had a little less autonomy over my decision making, it became more about, in a way, almost more about communication, in the sense that I needed to figure out how I could preserve my voice while handing down directives that came from above my head. And again, figuring out how to do that in a way that still felt true to me. And oftentimes I wasn't sure how to reconcile those two things.
How long were you with that company?
Yeah, it was nearly 10 years.
It's a good amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And again,
this is effectively your first job.
Yes. Yeah. And I just attribute that to, again, the upward mobility. It really felt like, okay, well, why would I leave even though, as I mentioned, like a lot of that internal conflict was growing and growing, it was manifesting in anxiety and work nightmares and just this always on sense, which to some degree in the agency world is a requirement. Business hours don't apply so much in the agency world when
Right.
your client needs a thing on Monday. It carried over into this internal sense of urgency, internal sense of duty to always be on, especially in a management role, asking my team to be available. Of course, I needed to always be on as well.
How do you satisfy the needs of the client and this manufactured sense of urgency while still creating buy-in from your team to not just meet those deadlines, but to also put their self into it and the creativity?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. We did our best to address all of that up front, knowing how manufactured deadlines are, getting tired of hearing that the deadline is yesterday. Sales calls, pre-kickoff messaging, and kickoff calls, digging into what's driving that deadline. That was one of the key questions we never skipped. Sometimes the answer is, we dropped the ball, we have this conference in 3 days and we need this copy in 1 day in order to send it to the printer. So sometimes there is that hard deadline where it's, okay, either we'll see what we can do, or I'm sorry, it doesn't look like this is going to work out. And that comes down to resource management, which I also took on for quite a long time.
Can you describe what resource management is?
Yeah, so we went through many forms of resource management over the years, starting with a spreadsheet and then moving into project management tools. But essentially taking the work weeks of all of our creative team and dividing it amongst the different projects that they had. And so oftentimes we were able to do this in a pretty mathematical or even visual way that's like, okay, this designer, we need to allocate 50% of their week, aka 20 hours or so, to this project, and then 50% to this project, and then they're at capacity. So
is that mostly about who's just available, or do you also factor in where someone's strengths are that might lend better towards a certain client or project?
Yeah, it's both. And some of that over the years came down to title development as well, moving senior designers into art director roles and things like that, so that we could understand when we were scoping a project whether a client truly needed a senior designer and a team of creative to really drive the vision, or whether a junior designer could execute on exactly what was needed. Same for the content team and the project management team. So yeah, specific skills definitely drive into it, and that can influence the schedule and turnaround time that we give to the client as well. If a project really requires a senior person who isn't available for 3 weeks, then we can start your project in 2 weeks and get the content out of the way, but we can't start right away.
I'm going to use, by the way, this description outline of resource management in my personal life. I often talk about like time management as it relates to our family calendar things. I'm going to start assigning chores and tasks to my kids and call it resource management.
Right. You're really great at washing the dishes, but not so good at putting them away. So
I'd like to leverage your skills, but also give you an opportunity to continue growing at home.
Senior dishwasher. Yeah.
Good news. You're up for a promotion, but it's also performance review time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. So 10 years into that company, when did you know it was time to move on?
Mm-hmm. It had been a few years that I was rolling this around in my head because, again, the anxiety and the overwhelm and the burnout was really starting to set in a management role where you're managing multiple teams and the resources of the company. You don't get to burn out. You have to keep doing it anyway. I knew for a couple of years that it wasn't something that I wanted to do for the next few decades, but that was really where the insight ended. I had no clue what I would do next, and I knew that I was in an incredibly successful role and had, like, quote, made it. So leaving didn't really make sense, especially if I didn't know what I wanted to do next. So I just kind of stayed stuck there because really as far as I could get was just signing off at the end of the day, complaining to my husband for the 1,000th time about how terrible my day was, having a couple 5 o'clock glasses of wine and going to bed and doing it all over again.
Yeah. Who do you think wanted a job more, you or your husband? So he didn't have to hear it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was a saint for putting up with that. As a corporate leader, I was making it. I had a decent salary as well. So there were a lot of considerations to figure out. If I knew that I was really unhappy in this role, would jumping to a similar position at another company really help for longer than maybe the 3 months of, ooh, this is new and fresh and exciting. It was really when 2020 hit that obviously everything felt out of control. There was so much going on. I started to realize maybe my career is more in my control than it felt like at the time, when everything seemed normal and clear cut and you have a good job, so you keep the good job. People were losing their jobs at a time when we didn't know if you would ever get another job again. It really put things into perspective for me to realize, like, I probably could actually do something about this and take some initiative to figure out what I want to do next and get out of here. That really started to put the wheels in motion.
Are you able to figure out or identify what it was that finally empowered you to do that? What was the catalyst for change?
Yeah, it was a little bit of all of that. Obviously, our company was hit like everybody else with, or many other companies and industries, with the economic decline and everybody tightening their purse strings. And we unfortunately had to go through 2 rounds of layoffs during the pandemic. And it was the first time that I had to lay people off, in the sense that financially we couldn't keep the headcount that we had.
What was that like for you?
Mm-hmm. It's heartbreaking. And again, this happened after we had been acquired. These decisions were being made, again, above our heads, but it was something that had to be done. And we put our heads together and tried to figure out anything we could do, taking pay cuts. What can we do to not lose people? And we did. The executive team ended up taking a small pay cut to probably saved one resource, one person. But again, at the end of the day, that the decision was being made for us. And as their managers, we were the ones who needed to communicate this. We did have the support of HR, and that was a really interesting experience, because again, there's so much legal implications going on behind the scenes that isn't really something that we knew too much about, to where, when the actual conversations are had, it's basically being led by HR. We set the meeting and sit there while the conversation is had with the employee. And again, because this was during the pandemic, it was all on Zoom. So we're watching people lose their livelihood over Zoom, and we just pretty much have to sit there.
Yeah.
It was horrible. Yeah. Yep. And I didn't want to have to do that anymore. And it also then put into perspective the fact that nobody's job is safe, and my job isn't safe. And would I rather sit around being miserable and burnt out and waiting to perhaps be let go outside of my control? Or would I rather take the reins and take initiative and leave on my own terms? And that was really the key realization for me.
I could not have asked for a more well-described answer to my question. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's hard to share that part, because there is a reality of the outside perception that you are sitting in the seat that is being retained, and boo-hoo for you, the person on the other side of that Zoom is being let go. And that is the hardest thing, to be in that position, to be let go. And it's also hard in a different way to be on the other side, who's sort of being saved and having to be part of that conversation. It's a completely different experience. This isn't a competition of who has it worse. But there is a challenge of going through the administrative side of a layoff. I think it deserves the respect and sympathy of that process itself.
Yeah. It's incredibly difficult, but of course, as you say, as the person who's staying on board and as the person whose face they're looking at as they're being laid off, we can't ask for their sympathy, and we can only commiserate with each other as the managers who are all being part of this. It's not something that we put on the rest of the team, of course.
No, or it's friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
Go home and you cry to your loved one.
Yeah.
And you try to move on.
Lots of tears. Yeah.
Are there any lessons or skills that you feel you truly personally gained going through that hardship of a round of layoffs?
I am someone who is extremely conflict averse. And so I will pretty much do anything I can to avoid situations where someone else is upset with me. And that as a manager, you don't really get to avoid those things. So I guess I learned a little more resilience and a little more patience. But I guess resilience was probably the main thing that I could only have gained by going through difficult times like layoffs and also like some of the earlier conversations as any manager needs to go through. I think that was really key because you can't escape conflict. You can't escape difficult conversations, nor necessarily should you. And by shying away from them, you're doing a disservice to the other person as well as yourself. And so I am really grateful that I was able to have that experience of, delivering difficult news, knowing that I could get through it, knowing that I could retain my humanity and personhood, and also just knowing that that lent itself to my whole journey of figuring out what I was actually meant for instead. You cannot be self-employed without resilience. You cannot be an entrepreneur without resilience. And today I am those things. And I never pictured myself being self-employed. But building those skills was definitely a requirement to getting there.
Was that the next step? Did you leave that job to pursue your own entrepreneurial endeavors?
Yes. So in the spring of 2021, our former business coach for the company when we were smaller advised me one way that I could get unstuck from this whole spiral of not being sure what the heck I wanted to do next, that likely the reason I hadn't figured it out was because I hadn't taken some dedicated time and space to figure it out. And so it was actually on his advice that I set aside a day or a half day to just sit with myself, go through prompts and exercises and figure this thing out. And that ended up being the catalyst, the turning point for me, where I was able to dissect why specifically I was so unhappy in this role. What beyond just saying, oh, this was uncomfortable, I didn't like this. Well, why? Well, what about it? What specifically don't you like? What would you love to do every day? What would you love to never have to do again? And just spent hours detailing all of these things in deep introspection and self-exploration, literally by myself in a rented conference room. And that changed my life. And that got me closer to the point where I realized that while I loved supporting people, like I said, I enjoyed the conversations where I felt I was able to give my colleagues what they needed from a conversation. I didn't like being in a supervisory capacity with them. And as I started to explore, well, what other opportunities are more like that, I discovered coaching. And I guess the rest is history.
How did you start answering the questions? Where did they come from?
Some of the initial prompts were suggested by my mentor. We had also, over the course of many years of executive leadership, done several offsite planning meetings as an executive team where we all got together in a room for 4 to 6 hours and spent time planning the upcoming quarter, the upcoming half, the upcoming year. And while a lot of those questions obviously centered around business conversations, like, well, what revenue target do we want to hit? And how is this business segment performing? There was also a lot of trust building and introspection and an encouragement to be brutally honest with each other about what we were thinking, feeling, and experiencing. And so that inspired a lot of the questions and exploration as well. So it was a combination of suggestions from the mentor, past experience, online prompts, and just any follow-up questions or themes that jumped out at me while I was in the middle of it.
How did you go about starting your new business? Where did you find that guidance to how to do this?
So during the whiteboarding day, introspection day itself, I got, again, like sort of the hint, the clue that maybe coaching could be a thread to explore. But obviously that was after several hours of introspection. And so it became a task, an action item for myself to explore over the coming months. I laid out, okay, well, now that I know that I'm leaving because I have this thread that I know I want to do next, what's my actual plan going to be? And so I left that meeting with to-dos about literally when I was going to put in my notice, when I was going to research coaching certification programs, when I was going to choose one, when I was going to start, and also figuring out how I was going to supplement my income on this journey, knowing that for me, the priority was to quit and then figure it out versus getting things started and then quitting. I also knew that the level of always onness that I was in with this role just wouldn't allow me any spare energy, much less time, to figure it out myself. So setting those action plans before I left was key, setting those steps with a timeline.
Your calendar that day every year, make it a personal holiday for yourself. Introspection day. You should do something every year on that day in the same spirit of whiteboarding and process these.
Yeah, commemorate.
Day. Yeah, commemorate.
Yeah, and I, while I was in the sort of in-between stage, I did repeat it. I did rent another space, and I did have another introspective day where I was able to reflect back on what I had accomplished, which is very important. If you don't recognize what you've accomplished, it's very easy to lose steam, and then continue my planning. So by the time I had that next reflection day, I was in my coaching program, which was self-paced. So I was then setting a date for when I wanted to complete it and planning out all the steps to starting a business, literally like filing an LLC and all those little things that I didn't know anything about. And again, that whole process was a combination of research, networking, and then leaning on our former founder and CEO, who became a close friend of mine and was just an indispensable advisor throughout the process as she'd started and grown many businesses. So it was incredibly helpful to have that technical, intellectual support and experience alongside just a supportive friend.
When you and I met, I was asking about what you're currently doing, and you described your coaching specifically around career discovery coaching. And I thought that was very uniquely different from a lot of the other either executive coaches, career coaches, advisors, and therapists for that matter. What they were doing, you described very specifically about helping individuals discover career opportunities. How did you land on that as a very specific concentration of your coaching?
Mm-hmm. It was really just the power of how transformative that introspective day was for me, knowing that without that, I wouldn't have gotten unstuck, and realizing that a lot of the career support services that I see out there are focused on the attaining the job. So how to tweak your resume and mock interviews, interview skills, and things like that. And of course, those are powerful and instrumental when you're at that point where you're looking to land a role. But if we skip ahead to that point, you could land a really great job that you're probably still going to hate. And so how do we avoid coming back again and again and saying, well, maybe my resume just wasn't good enough. Maybe I just didn't answer that interview question well enough. Did you even want the job in the first place? And why or why not specifically? So
you should consider lending all of your model and to the dating apps too. You've been through relationships that haven't worked out. Maybe stop repeating, looking for the same kind of person.
Why or why not? Yeah. And to some degree, it makes sense because obviously it's worked before. We landed the job. We were able to retain the job. So to some degree, we succeeded. But when you start to realize that those patterns aren't serving you, or that especially if you've hopped jobs and are still experiencing a lot of the same feelings, it's not you, it's the role at a point. Yeah, that's really what led me to jump in on that focus and focus less on the hard skills and more on the self-discovery aspect.
Could you give our audience, anybody who's listening right now, if there's any kind of advice or a tip to help somebody get clarity on their career?
Yeah, I mean, not to be a broken record, but I would say it's really setting aside dedicated time and space to think this through. When you give yourself just your commute or just your morning shower to think it through, you're rushing the process, you're missing details, and probably most importantly, you're missing out on the ability to make connections and identify patterns and themes in what you're experiencing. Instead, you're kind of just having to play things on repeat because you lose the thread as soon as you get out of the shower and have to go to work. It may feel like you don't have any time and space to give, but what I would say is the more showers and commutes that you spend stressing about this, it's going to add up to a lot more time than if you would spend 4 hours on a Saturday drawing the connections all in one space.
I find the hardest part about making time is literally making the first 30 seconds. Once you start the process, you're in a flow, you're starting to do it, and time seems to go away. You don't think about it, and you're in a flow, and you're getting real work accomplished, and you're being productive.
So if you can get clear on why you're at your wit's end and why specifically you're setting this time on your calendar in the first place, you can even make that part of your calendar invite. So rather than just putting down introspection time, it's like figure out how to quit my job or, figure out what comes next. Step 1 of 20 is figure this out.
Make an agenda with goals and even call to actions for yourself. We do it for work all the time. Mm-hmm. It's almost expected when you set a meeting. What's the agenda? What are we hoping to accomplish? How long is this going to take? And what are the call to actions for when we're done? Mm-hmm. The follow-up. So do that for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other component I would say is if you're able to find a dedicated space to do this that is outside of your normal working zone, I highly recommend that too. I mentioned I rented a conference room because literally my purpose for being there was to have this meeting with myself and have this introspective time. I think it costs like $100 to have the space for 4 hours or something like that. There are also plenty of free options at community centers, at local coffee shops, sometimes the library. So you don't have to spend money. You don't have to get a fancy Airbnb, although you could totally do that. That would be awesome too. Yeah. But when you're trying to do it, in your living room while your roommate's home or in the office where you do your work every day and you're just probably going to start checking your email and working instead of doing it, there is really something to be said for just getting into a different space as well.
This may sound unusual, but it's probably likely that you have a handful of friends and peers that work at other companies that would allow you to come in and sit at a desk for half a day. Mm-hmm. Or a full day. Change the environment, get out of your routine, make it really intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other key component to success is figuring out what your own accountability system looks like. So once you've taken this dedicated time and you've started to connect the thread, what is your plan for your next steps and how are you going to stay on track with that? Especially if you're somebody who kept putting off that meeting over and over again, or you rescheduled it over and over again. How are you going to make sure that you actually follow through with it and get yourself out of this hole? And that looks different to everybody. It can be a person, a family, a friend, a spouse. It can be a mentor. It can be a coach. It can be maybe not the best idea depending on who you're friends with, but social media, posting your steps. So here's my 100-day journey to quitting my job.
I would argue that that's a great idea. It might sound ridiculous at first, but I think that's just because it's unconventional and you're being authentic, and it probably will open other doors if that's what you're looking for too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm striving to do that myself with transparency about what the journey is like from, for instance, quitting your job without a backup, being self-employed for the first time. I'm not trying to sit here and say that I opened my coaching business and that all my sessions were full on day one. It's a journey. It's a work in progress.
I'm excited to see your company grow, the services that you provide to continue to grow. And your link will be in the bio and the description down below. So feel free to check it out. And Lucy, it's been great having you on the show today. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
I want to thank Lucy Todd for being today's guest on the show, and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this episode of Transferable Skills. Remember, the skills you've gained can take you anywhere. Until next time, keep exploring those transferable skills.